Welcome to today's Research Pays Off. Our speaker today is Richard Willis. Now that I am done with the script, Richard is the Vice President of Engineering, Research, and Technology. He's NAPA's expert on mixed design, recycled materials, life cycle cost analysis, and pavement design. Prior to joining NAPA, Richard was at Auburn University, where he was a research professor, which is where I got to know Richard. Like I said, I'm excited for today's presentation. While at Auburn, he was a professor for me, as well as I TA'd his courses, and I would go to his lectures for his undergrad class that I was not in, just for entertainment. So I don't know if he's going to have Rice Krispie treats to explain binder content. But Richard is always a dynamic presenter, so we're excited to have him. And with that, I'll turn it over to Richard. And Richard, take it away for us, please.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I'm happy to be here today. This probably isn't going to be your typical kind of research pays off presentation, because we're going to talk a little bit about some research that's going on, but we're also going to really spend a little bit more time thinking about where we could be, or maybe what research we need to be doing to help us reach some of these goals that are in front of us. I'm sure many of you have heard me do a presentation on the road forward, which NAPA released a few years ago. So some of this may sound familiar. There may be a few things that we've added, but it's really trying to help us look at where we could go. For those of you who know me, a lot of people see me as someone who is deep and grounded in sustainability. But the reality is, it was about 10 years ago or 12 years ago now that I knew nothing about sustainability. I wasn't thinking about things like emissions. Randy West literally walked into my office and said, I think sustainability is going to be important for the industry. Can you be our new expert on it? And at that point, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what sustainability meant. I didn't know how it was going to impact the industry. But then, very similar, about 2 or 3 years ago, I was talking with Audrey and the NAPA's board of directors about where we needed to go as an industry. And basically, they challenged us at that point. They wanted us to create a vision for the industry. The 3 specific goals I was given were, first, to come up with a set of objectives or goals for industry related to climate and related to emissions. And it didn't have to be achieving net zero. It was just figure out what we can do. The second thing was to figure out how we can talk about this internally to producers and externally to our stakeholders eventually. And the third was really develop that roadmap. Develop a path that we could take, whether it's research, whether it's implementation, technology transfer. How are we going to get there? So it was in February of 2022 at the NAPA annual meeting in Scottsdale, Arizona, that we showed this video for the first time. And that was excellent because I embedded the wrong video in there. Things like that happen all the time. So what we're trying to do is create a groundswell, and create a vision that not just industry could get behind, but the entire asphalt community. We wanted something that DOTs could look at, and as pieces of legislation are introduced, like we're going to talk about in a little while, or new policy is set, they could rely on what we developed as the road forward as a way to help us get there. As industry is challenged to create low carbon construction materials, as we'll talk about in a little bit, the road forward provides those kind of guideposts on how do we move forward. So the road forward has a fairly simple objective. The objective is to basically educate, empower, and engage the U.S. asphalt community to produce and construct net zero carbon emission pavements by 2050. Now, it's fine to have an objective, it's fine to have a vision, but in order for us to get there, we had to set some goals. We had to start looking at how are we actually going to achieve this? And so we set 4 goals. And if you're familiar with the EPA greenhouse gas reporting protocol, these are kind of looking at the different type scope emissions that are required for that reporting. And so our first goal is looking at kind of what would be classified as scope 1 emissions for an asphalt producer, and that's to produce and construct net zero carbon emission asphalt pavements. Goal 2 is what we would classify as emissions, and that goal is to partner with our owners and specifiers to improve pavement durability and energy efficiency. Goal 3 would be our upstream scope 3 emissions, and that is really looking at developing a net zero material supply chain. Goal 4, again, because everyone loves to set a goal that you have zero control over, is to pull from a net zero grid. And the reason we have to do that is, again, it's part of our emission value chain. And this is what EPA would classify as a scope 2 emission. And then the last thing is looking at something called carbon offsets. Because in order to get to zero, using the accounting and technology that we have right now, there's going to be something that has to pull us back to zero. Now, one of the things that's been really cool about working with the Road Forward is we had the opportunity to come on board and support it. It's a massive effort that's requiring us to do things that NAPA has never done before and pull in research and consultants to help us educate, engage, and empower the community. And these are companies that have come on as partners with us in 2022 and 2023. And we always want to acknowledge them and thank them for their support of this, because we couldn't do what we're doing today without them. Now, how do we do this? There are a lot of people that look at the term net zero and they think that there's no way. It's too big, it's too challenging. And the common analogy that we give people is, listen, when Kennedy said we're going to put a man on the moon in the 1960s, by the end of the decade, they didn't have the technology at that time. Some of the science hadn't been invented. Some of the technology was years away from being thought about. But he set a goal, and then things happen. Sometimes we have to take kind of that leap of faith that we're going to set a goal, and I don't know exactly those last few steps that it's going to take to get us over that hump. But what can we be doing right now? And that's really what we want to talk today about, is what are those opportunities? What are those research gaps that we might be able to help start looking at? And so when we start thinking about our goal 1, simply put, it's net zero production and construction. So we're looking at things like asphalt plants, we're looking at trucking, we're looking at the construction process. And one of the first things we set out that we needed to do was we need to understand where our emissions are even coming from during production and construction. And so in last year, around this time, NAPA released a greenhouse gas emissions inventory report that really looked at 1 through A3, which is your materials, transporting your materials to your asphalt plant, and then your asphalt plant emissions itself for the entire US. And really shouldn't be a shocker. The big thing that drives you during production and construction is your burner, the type of fuel that you're using, also the ability to run cooler. But when we start thinking about things like production and construction and getting to net zero, there's a lot of policies, procedures, and specs that are in place that may be hindering us from getting to where we need to be. There are places where you're going to have a minimum asphalt temperature that has to be. You're going to have places where your lift thickness, your choice of lift thickness is going to impact your emissions, because it may impact how many lifts you have to put down. There's your trucking process, and we take a lot of money and a lot of emissions in trucking material to job sites. And in October 2022, NAPA actually released an efficient trucking document for additional support on how do we reduce emissions further in this. But one of the biggest challenges that we have is our asphalt plant technology. And in order to upgrade a lot of the plants that are out there, it's going to take a significant amount of capital investment to take some plants that have been there for a generation or two and make them more modern. But it's not just that. The plants that we use, we could do a lot better with in many cases. NAPA has an old document that was their quality improvement series number 26, and it was energy savings and energy management for your plant facility. In this year, luckily it's in layout right now, we've got a new document that I affectionately call that's going to kind of update this, how to save money and reduce emissions at your asphalt plant. It's how do I look at my operations as a manufacturer and do things that I know are not just going to reduce emissions, but they're going to allow me to be more competitive. They're going to allow me to improve the bottom line. And this document addresses many things that we know we should be doing, but sometimes we just don't. Things like reducing your aggregate moisture content by 1% can save you about 10% in fuel. Reducing your exit material temperature strategy can save you about 2% in energy. The exit gas temperature can reduce your 10 degrees can save you 1% energy. There are numerous things that we can be doing, but we need the tools, we need the education to help plant operators understand why that they're doing this. And it's not just plant operators, sometimes it's even the customer. Industry does a lot of private work as well as just DOT work. And a lot of times the private companies come in, they want that material smoking hot. And they think that that's what's going to make it better for them. But we have to educate them on these opportunities. One of the other things that we're doing is if you go to our Road Forward website, which is asphaltpavement.org/climate or /forward, we've got operational tips, which are basically ways to help you reduce emissions and higher process. And we're doing actually case studies. So we have got a case study from Granite Construction on their ROI for insulating their plant better. We've got a case study from Michigan Paving where they're looking at 2 plant moisture contents and the energy saving from one where they paved on their stockpiles and one where they didn't. We're highlighting a company in Orlando, Florida. They're no longer using hot oil for their tank farms, but they're using electricity in the move. And then one day as the grid gets cleaned, their emissions are going to go down significantly. There's another company we're highlighting that's using liquefied natural gas and the emissions and cost savings from these. We want to continue to show people opportunities for improving in these spaces. But again, there's a lot of things that we just know how to do, but we don't necessarily do it. When we look at warm mix, in 2009, when NAPA started conducting its annual survey on warm mix usage and RAS and other recycled materials, we were using about 5% warm mix in the country. In 2020, it was up to 46%. In 2021, I think it was around 44. So we're still around almost half of the material that we're producing is using a warm mix technology. However, only half of that is actually being done at reduced temperatures. And there are opportunities in this to further push us further when we're looking at this. A big source of emissions can be in the production construction phase, can actually be in your trucking operations. For example, there are parts of the country where they are aggregate rich. There are other parts that are aggregate poor. And if you're having to send material hundreds of miles via truck, you can actually see that be a significant portion of your emissions for a ton of asphalt mix. For example, the difference between 100 miles and 500 miles, which some people do have to truck, is significant. But if I can potentially train or use a barge or an ocean vessel, that's a different opportunity. But it is still significant compared to what your typical trucking operation is. There's a lot of places where asphalt plants sit in a quarry. The other parts of the country where your asphalt plants wherever your job is because you're at a portable operation and who knows where your aggregate's coming from. So considering where you are, your aggregate may be a significant factor in your emissions and moving to net zero. So looking at how you use your locally available aggregate, even if it's not as high quality, but figuring out ways and doing your research to figure out how to use it effectively could potentially reduce costs of materials, but also could reduce your emissions as well from the transportation of those different materials. Another thing that we commonly stress is as we're looking at reducing emissions, the last thing that I want to do is reduce quality. I want to make sure that I am still producing as high quality material and mix as I possibly can. And so we want to do things like partnering with our customers to reduce emissions through pavement quality, durability, longevity, and efficiency. And so this is looking at how do we set specs differently? How do we design our pavements differently? And one common thing is we could actually design perpetual pavements. I commonly joke with Amy Miller, who runs the Asphalt Pavement Alliance, that we've been giving out perpetual pavement awards for many years now, but the majority of them are perpetual pavements by accident. We over-design these. Instead of intentionally going in and figuring out how do we maximize our material usage and get the most out of our pavements. And if perpetual pavements is something you're interested in, I would ask you to consider looking at, we've got a call for abstracts out right now for a perpetual pavement conference that's going to be in Louisville, Kentucky in October 2023. And how do we design and build this? The case study of what y'all are building up at with NRRA would be an interesting place or an interesting opportunity to talk about this. Some other things that we need to be thinking about is improving quality. Are there ways we can incentivize that? Virginia is a state that has a 15% bonus for a smoothness incentive because they've realized it saves money, it saves fuel, it improves pavement life, and it allows them to get more out of it. We're in the near future going to be releasing a new kind of design method for looking at crack and seat, break and seat, and rubblization. And how do we take failing concrete pavements and build solid asphalt on top of them? But there are things that we can be doing in this stage of life to improve. A study was done out of UC Davis or the University of California Pavement Research Center recently, and they published what it could mean for the life cycle, a 30-year life cycle of pavement, if they were to get a little bit more density out of their mixes. And it saw that it was pretty significant over the life of the pavement, almost a 20% savings. But things like improving density. Now, but where's the return on investment end on that? Do I get the same savings in terms of cost or performance moving from 90 to 92 that I would from 94 to 96? Probably is better from 90 to 92 than you get in the other way. So there's some research that needs to be done in understanding that. I think we're looking into some of that through Capri right now. What other case study was done looking at Iowa and perpetual pavement design and using conventional design versus the perpetual alternative. And when you look at most of the environmental categories, we see a significant reduction in terms of the life cycle emissions of a pavement when we look at specifically moving towards perpetual pavement design. One of the biggest things, though, that we as an industry are focusing on right now is that net zero material supply chain, because that is something that I can somewhat control. Some of it is specified to me, but some of it is opportunities that we have to work with people or choices that I can make. And one of the things that we can do is we know we can increase recycled material. We know we can do that. Right now, the national average has been hovering at around 21, 22% for probably about the last 5 or 6 years. But there are some parts of the country where they're using more than 30%. There are some parts of the world where they're averaging 75 or more. And I'm not advocating that we do that everywhere. We recently did an industry survey to figure out, well, what's the biggest thing that's holding you back from using more recycled material? And there are some places that said, you know what, it's the specifications. The other places that said, I don't have REP. We're not milling in my state. We don't have a good milling program, so I don't have material to use if I could. And so every place is going to have to look at things a little bit differently. I really think that balanced mix design is another opportunity, because as people start thinking about use of recycled materials, people want to automatically go, well, you're making your pavements poor quality. I don't believe that always. I think you can make a virgin mix or a recycled material mix that performs really well. And I think you can also design and construct one that's going to fail pretty quickly if you don't watch what you're doing. But the reality is BMD gives us that opportunity to have a little bit more comfort in moving to some of these other areas and moving to some of these things. But the reality is we've also got to make some changes. If we're moving towards these types of specifications, we should be relaxing some of the volumetric requirements, because ultimately performance is what matters. We're hosting a summit next month looking at how do we move forward in some of these areas together. We work with our binder suppliers, our additive suppliers? How do we start thinking about new materials and technology that's going to allow us to advance into these areas that we can't even fathom right now? Like I said, RAP is one of the biggest assets we have as an industry. And while we look at this trend over the last 10 years or 11 years, we do see that we've been using more and more RAP. The challenge is it's because we've been using more and more asphalt mix over the last few years as well. And when we think about where we're going, we need to start thinking a little more boldly, I think. And we need to start thinking about our research a little bit more boldly. If you look over the last 10 years, We've spent probably in the $40 million range as an industry trying to increase doing research to increase wrap content mixes without actually doing it. We struggle with actually implementation. And that's one of the things I like about this webinar series. It's about showing, hey, when we put research into practice, here are the good things that it can do for you. But I remember working on NCHRP 946 with Randy West and developing new high wrap mix design standards and how do we quantify and look at binder and how do we address some of these issues. And I don't know really any state that's actually implemented that in the 7 or 8 years it's been out. I don't know many states that have implemented the findings from 955 looking at recycled asphalt shingles with warm mix and how to move it forward. We do a lot of research, but we struggle with actually putting things into practice. One of the things that I challenge people to do is think differently about their research. I look at a lot of the research that's being put out or being put forward, and I classify it as very defensive research. It's how do I keep bad things from happening? I've never read the book. I couldn't tell you the other 6, but when you look at Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of a Highly Effective Person, I do know habit 2 is begin with the end in mind. We need to think about where we want to be. Is our goal to have mixes and pavements that don't fail, or is it to have mixes that perform and we maximize that? Is our goal to prevent bad things from happening, or is it more to have a pavement system in your state that thrives and gives the riders what they need? I think when we need to look at our research and figure out where do we actually want to be in 15, 20, 30 years, and let's plan accordingly. Let's figure out how do I get to the good, and then along the way you'll prevent the bad from happening, but it may look a little different. It may cause you to rethink and rejigger how you write specifications, how you look at it. We need to start thinking more positively about where we're going and how we're going to try to get there. And like I said, I really think BMD is one of those opportunities. BMD was defined by the old ETG as asphalt mix design using performance tests on appropriately conditioned specimens, and you can read that better than I can probably say it right now. More simply, it's using the right mix for the right job. Now, why do I think BMD has an opportunity for us here? It's because I think if we fully embrace this, on the material side of things, on the improved performance side of things, BMD can get us a long ways towards net zero. There are 4 different approaches that people take when they look at it, and I'm going to kind of define them this way. So you got your volumetric design with performance verification. And that's where I take my typical volumetric design that I've got right now for my DOT, and then I throw another performance test on this. And what I've done is I've taken the contractor's risk and a target that was originally about that big, and I've now taken it down to a target that's about that big, potentially with no real benefit. I kind of call this the Little Debbie school of mixed design. It's when you buy an oatmeal cream pie, you know exactly what you're getting. There's a standard recipe, there's a standard process that every single one of those things follows, so they know exactly what they get. But at the end, it's a Little Debbie. It's going to look like an oatmeal cream pie. It's going to taste like an oatmeal cream pie. It may be special when you're younger, but when you're older, it's not necessarily what you're always craving. Option 2 is the volumetric design with performance optimization. I call this the Amy Willis school of mixed design, where Amy loved to bake. Recipe, but tweak it just a little. She would keep the science sound, so she wouldn't change like the egg, the fat to whatever ratios in there. I cook, I don't bake. But she might add a little bit of a different seasoning. She might add a little bit more of this to try to make it a little bit more exciting. And that's really what this type of volumetric design is I can tweak the volumetrics a little bit based on the performance expectations that I need. The third is performance modified volumetric. I call this kind of the Alton Brown school of mixed design, where you keep the science. You're not really worried about the specifics of the recipe, but you're really wanting to make sure that in the end, the volumetrics are set so that nothing's going to go too bad. But you want to optimize the mixed components and proportions through your performance testing. And the final is performance design. And this is really all I care about is performance. Now, we're maybe not at a place where we're ready for approach D, because we have to have the fundamental, we have to have these performance tests or these balanced mix design tests solid enough that we trust that they're going to weed out the good and the bad mixes, and they're going to be able to separate them. But eventually, if performance is what matters, that's what we should be judged on. I don't walk into a 3-star restaurant or 4-star restaurant and hand the chef the recipe, watch them cook it, make sure I time it under the heat lamp to make sure they're too long. No, what I care about at the end of the day is when it's put in front of me, did it taste good? That's where our goal should be. Is at the end of the day, does that mix perform? Now, there are things that can be done along the process that are going to make it not perform as well. You can mess that up in plant operations. You can mess that up in construction. You can put a really good piece of really good asphalt on top of a really lousy foundation or broken up road. And guess what? It's not going to last as long. But in the mixed side of things, that's what we're looking for. Because when we have the opportunity to move from A to D, we have the opportunity to innovate. We have the opportunity to potentially take more local materials and use them. We have the opportunity to allow contractors to use their kitchen, the asphalt plant, with their locally available materials and try to make something that's going to perform the best at the lowest emission and the lowest cost for their customer. Kind of moving on, our goal, one of our goals is around a net zero grid. Net zero energy is where the entire country is trying to go. But it's not just that. I want it to be zero, but I need to also think about things like efficiencies. Because as we move to more renewable resources or renewable energy, I want to make sure that I'm not putting too much of a burden on the electric grid if we're all plugging our cars into it. We want to make sure that we're thinking about how we move all those things going forward. And then the last part of really that road forward plan was looking at carbon offsets. And again, it's net zero, not total zero. If I'm getting a piece of aggregate out of the ground, if I'm making asphalt binder, there are emissions associated with that. But the reality is we want to, as an industry, try to push this as low as possible and then offset as little as possible. And offsets are going to be something that we're going to be looking at and talking about in the near future. Now, I tried to stress this earlier because a lot of people think that when I start talking about things like low carbon, that immediately I'm now creating a bunch of trash asphalt mix. And the reality is sustainability and quality are not mutually exclusive terms. Not at all. In fact, when we start thinking about things from a life cycle, the longer I can make it last, the better it's going to be. But we also see this in our greenhouse gas emissions inventory, that we can produce asphalt mixtures at a lower carbon material based on the technology that we have right now and still get them to perform. And this is specifically when we start looking at things like RAP. And there are benefits to RAP as pavement owners. And we've put out a document recently about why RAP's important for you as owners and what it could mean. But specifically, when we start looking at things like emissions, which is coming to a state near you very, very soon, if we could move our national RAP content by 1%, so if we could take that national average, which was 21.1% when our report was written, and move it to 22.1%, that's the equivalent of taking 30,000 passenger cars off the road for a year in terms of emission savings. One little thing can have a significant impact in what we're trying to do in moving to net zero. So what if we could do some different things? Like what if we could increase our RAP content from where we're in 2019 from 21 to 40%. What if we could increase the amount of natural gas that we use? Because natural gas is going to have less emissions than some of the other things like propane and diesel and other oils. What if we could reduce our moisture content in our mixes by 1% by either doing things like covering our stockpiles or paving under our stockpiles or getting aggregate that wasn't washed? What if we could reduce our asphalt production temperature by 40 degrees from where we are now, or reduce the electricity intensity? You know, doing some of these things which we know how to do right now, hitting some of those what we classified as kind of long-term goals, that's a 24% reduction. That's a 24% reduction in our materials, transportation, and production side of things. There's significant impacts that we could be doing as we're starting to look at things like low carbon construction materials. Now, why is this important for us? One, when I talk to contractors, I tell them many times the things that are going to save you emissions affect your bottom line. They're improving efficiencies. They're making you better as a company, and that can impact your profit. That could impact your bids. I commonly tell people that the next generation, the people that are coming into your workforce, this is who they are. This is going to be something that no matter what part of the side of the aisle they're on, they're going to care about. And they may use different terms, and they may not necessarily say things like climate change, but they care about the world that they live in. But the reality is also there's a lot happening right down the road from where I am today that's going to impact decision making. It's going to impact people's ability. And the legislation and these efforts are happening. And so we start looking at things like life cycle assessment and EPDs or environmental product declaration. LCA Pave was a tool that was developed by Federal Highways a couple of years ago, and it looks at cradle to grave LCA for pavements. We have the Emerald Eco label, which is an EPD program, which is commonly seen as like the nutrition label for environmental impacts for an asphalt mix. But it helps make sure that everyone producing an EPD for an asphalt mix is following the same set of rules and the same set of standards. Now, when you listen to a lot of what's happening in DC, there are certain terms that are being used. And I think it's very important that we understand the different types of carbon that are in these pieces of legislation or policy. And the two main ones that people talk about are embodied carbon and operational carbon. Now, and this was really set up in terms of language for things in vertical construction. We're trying to apply it to pavements. So it's not necessarily trying to shove a square peg in a round hole kind of a thing in many ways, but there are similarities. So I'm going to use a vertical construction example, and I think it'll translate well to what for roadways. So when people start to talk about embodied carbon is the amount of carbon released in the manufacture, the transportation, and installation of different construction materials. So think about the house or the building you're in right now. That would be the transportation of the carpet, the steel, the wood, the concrete, the paint, everything used to build the house or that building. Now, the operational carbon is all the carbon associated with using that building. So what is the energy and emissions associated with running the electricity for your computers and your Wi-Fi and your air conditioning and all those different things? That's the emissions that are used in the operational phase. So when you look at most of the policy that's coming out there, it is really focused on that embodied carbon standpoint. And so you have groups like the Buy Clean Task Force that's working for the White House right now, where they're coordinating across 17 different federal agencies that basically account for 90% of the construction materials purchased by the federal government. They're prioritizing steel, concrete, asphalt, and flat glass, and moving towards Buy Clean. And the USDOT came out. I was actually in Minnesota at Minroad the day that presentation went out of date. When USDOT came out, I think about an hour after I gave a presentation on this, where they said, you know, we are going to be developing a Buy Clean policy that's going to be based on EPDs. So USDOT has said they're moving in this direction. GSA was really one of the first ones out of the gate where they developed their environmentally preferred asphalt standard, where they're looking at federal office buildings, courthouses, land ports of entry. And in this standpoint, if you were going to be producing an asphalt mixture using this standard, you had to submit an EPD and use 2 different environmentally preferable techniques. Now, one of the reasons we worked with GSA to try to get this kind of a menu list is sustainability stems from a sense of place. And what may be sustainable in Minnesota may not be sustainable in Arizona. We talked about RAP availability. There are some places where they would love to use 21% RAP in their mix. There are some places that couldn't use 21% RAP in their mix if their life depended on it, just because of availability. And so we have to think about what is appropriate for that contractor. And so they were given that opportunity of hey, you can use warm mix with reduced on-site temperatures. You can use some kind of other recycled content, rubber, roof shingles. You could use natural gas as opposed to diesel, or some kind of other environmentally preferred technique that the contractor can propose. In 2022 and early 2023, there were 7 different asphalt projects that use this standard across the country. Then there's things like the carbon reduction program. It was a part of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure law, where there's a $6.4 billion program to help state reduce carbon emissions. Now, this was originally set up to try to get people to reduce VMT and get people off the roads, but FHWA put out guidance that said paving activities are eligible, but you have to use some kind of LCA or EPD to show the carbon reduction and that it fits under your program. So these monies are formulaic funds that can be distributed to the states, but that's an opportunity to potentially move in the direction that's going to allow you to do some different things. Again, there's now a federal Buy Clean partnership that's out there. And numerous states have come out and said, yes, the federal government is going Buy Clean, and we are going to as well. There are additional states that are part of the U.S. Climate Alliance that are committed to achieving the greenhouse gas reductions in accordance with the Paris Agreement. And there are states that are a part of NRRA that are definitely lit up in either the orange or the blue in this. And so eventually it will be coming to the DOT to look at how are you going to help reduce some of these emissions associated with your work. The Inflation Reduction Act was really stomped on the accelerator for the industry on this, because the EPA was given $250 million to standardize EPDs and help industry develop them. Another $100 million to develop a low carbon construction material labeling program, which has to be out by September 2026. And so the question then is, how is low embodied carbon going to be defined? How are we going to say what's low and what's not, or substantially low? The DOT was given $2 billion to procure construction materials with substantially lower embodied carbon. So this is for federal aid highway, federal lands. And in this program, what they can do is actually pay either the differential cost. So if it costs more,
I think you did. Yeah, were you in a little gray car?
To
yeah, you went too far. Come back, and it's right in the field there.
If it costs more to procure the low carbon construction materials, they'll pay that differential cost. And if it costs less, they will pay up to, I think it's a 2% incentive to the DOT for using those types of materials. But even FEMA now is looking at things like low carbon construction materials, where they're paying differential costs or incentives. HUT even put out started looking at low carbon construction materials. All of these different agencies are starting to consider how to move in that direction. And this is how low carbon is being defined right now by Congress to look at it. And so what they came up with is they want you to look at all the EPDs that are out there for your different materials, and you have to be in the top 20% to be low carbon. If that's not available locally, they'll let you go up to 40. If that's not available, you just have to beat the industry average. But eventually, these numbers are going to be set, and in fact, some of them have been set recently. Originally, GSA came out with this in January of 2023, where they basically said, okay, for all of our IRA money, we are going to now say, for asphalt mixtures, you have to be below 62.8 kilograms of CO2e per ton of asphalt mix. And I know really that number means nothing to probably most of you on the call. But that wasn't just the number on your EPD. You had to apply an uncertainty value to it, because we're not necessarily sure all these numbers are correct. Well, one of the challenges with this is that 62.8 was set in stone. And it didn't matter if it was a polymer modified mix versus a neat binder. It didn't matter if it was an SMA versus a dense graded mix. It didn't matter if you were in Phoenix, Arizona, where the DOT requires 1.5% lime, or in a state that doesn't require lime at all. And just so you're aware, lime is a significant impact. Adding 1.5% lime adds 18 kilograms of carbon dioxide to your ton of asphalt mix. But these limits applied to everything. Now, luckily, GSA took a little bit of feedback and went back to the drawing board a little bit. But it's impacting us all in different ways. The Federal Acquisition Regulation Commission is looking at contractors having to report their emissions, looking at scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, depending on how much federal work you do on an annual basis. If you get 7 to 50 million, you're a significant contractor, you have to report scope 1 and 2 emissions. If you're over 50 million in annual federal contracts, you have to report scope 3 as well. Now, by federal contracts, that's not federal aid highway work, but it would be if you're doing work for federal lands, National Park Services, DOD, those would count towards you. So as an industry, we're having to look at, how do I start looking at this? And if I'm a major contractor, I even have to start looking at things like setting science-based targets on what I'm going to do for emission reduction. Going back to GSA, a few weeks ago, on May 16th, GSA announced that they're going to actually have their new numbers in place. And what they basically did is they took out uncertainty. But the same limits apply to all mixes wherever you are in the country. And they decided there are going to be 6 different projects that use the substantially lower asphalt project. In Minnesota, you lucked out and don't have to worry about it right now. But there's going to be one in Colorado. There's going to be one in Arizona, Land Port of Entry, North Dakota, and Texas. And the challenge is, when you look at places like Arizona and Colorado, they're going to have significant trouble meeting some of these numbers because of the way specifications are written. Like in Arizona, you're going to have to use a polymer modified binder to handle the traffic and trucks at that limit, which is going to increase your carbon footprint. And Arizona requires lime, which increases the carbon footprint significantly. So NAPA has just been in the process of trying to do a benchmarking exercise for the country, looking at different regions and potentially down to a state level to try to come up with better, more meaningful numbers so that people can think locally and figure out, how do I do better where I am? And if everybody is trying to do better, it's going to allow us to move things forward together. And one of the things that we did is we met with FHWA and we met with EPA at a workshop at our office, where we started thinking about, how do we take all of these things that are happening? How do we take all these policies? How do we take these pieces of legislation and actually do something meaningful? Actually do something that's not just spending the money to spend the money, but trying to make a difference and trying to help industry goals as we're looking forward. Now, I know this is a lot. I know this is a lot. But the reality is, the landscape of construction materials is changing. And the way that we're doing business is going to be changing in the near future. So I typically end with this slide, or near the end, and I developed it for that rollout in 2022, and I think it's as pertinent today as it was then. If you're looking at this and trying to figure out, man, I have no clue what he's talking about. I don't know what a ton of carbon looks like or means, or what my asphalt plant is doing, or how my specifications could impact. The first thing you got to do is educate yourself. There's a lot of great information on NAPA's website related to this. FHWA Sustainable Pavement SWIG has a lot of great information. Start educating yourself. The second thing is get involved. Start plugging yourself in where you can to learn more, to listen to people talk about this, to share your ideas or your inputs. And the third thing is, be a partner. I love our partner program because it's companies that are committing to being involved, to helping us reach our goals. And that's what we need right now. This is something that as an industry, we are trying to, a rising tide lifts all ships kind of mentality. We've got to be working on this together and working with our owners as partners to try to help them reach goals that their state legislature or the federal government may have set for them. and we can work on these things together. And the fourth thing I would tell you is, if you did not start yet, then right now, June 20th, 2023 is the best time to start. You can't wait, or you will get, there have been states that have been blindsided by legislation. There have been DOTs which have been rocked by policy changes that have happened. Start thinking about this now so that you help write the script. You help write the future instead of having it written for you. I'd encourage you to go to our website, like I said, asphaltpavement.org/forward or Climate, either one, and look at the industry goals. If you're a researcher, we have research needs that are identified there. Some of them we've started working on, others that we haven't, but we're telling you this is what we need from you. We have our research that is that we publish on there because we want everyone to know about it. So there are opportunities to learn, there are opportunities to grow. We really hope you'll take this step with us, because it's not just for the asphalt industry, the producers. This is really going to take the asphalt community. It's going to take researchers helping us answer these questions. It's going to take manufacturers of equipment and plants and additives helping us get more efficient and get better. It's going to take us working with DOTs to change specs and potentially allow some new things in the future. But it's going to take us all working together to help reach these goals. So thank you very much for your time. That is the end of my presentation. I guess we've got some time for questions.
Yeah, perfect on time. Thanks for leaving time for questions, and thanks for the inspirational presentation, Richard. You even squoze in some cookie analogies for me, so thanks for bringing back good memories. If anybody has questions, feel free to raise your hand or type them in the chat. I don't see any in the chat yet, so I had one for you, Richard, just to get things started. So like you said, it's almost been a year since this first came out, or since you were up at Minroad at the end of last summer. Are you happy with the progress, and what is the surprises that you've seen over the last year?
Yeah, I am happy with the progress. The last year has really been kind of an educational effort. It's really been to help people kind of understand this. And we've had a lot of good conversations along the way. There's been some tough conversations and helping people understand kind of the direction. But I have been pleased, and there's been a relatively good reception from industry, from groups like FHWA and some of our other federal partners. And I think it's allowed us to open the door to a lot of conversations we would have never been able to have if this program had not been put together. And the great thing about it is, I didn't share the slide, but this was a program that was written by industry. We had a group of 21 of us, including a couple of academics, to make sure we weren't veering off into uncharted territory too much. But we had your CRHs of the world that are the largest asphalt producers in the country, to asphalt producers that had 2 or 3 asphalt plants in a state that would probably never utter the word climate change, put this together to make sure that it was something that everyone could look at and say, you know what, I could see someone like myself as one of the authors on here. And so that was a really rewarding and fun experience. And then just sharing it with people. But now we have to really start making some of the changes. And so that's what our big summit is about in a couple of weeks, is really developing that next set of strategy on, related to each goal, what are the next tactile things that we need to be working on to try to make a difference.
Yeah, thanks. And what stood out to me beyond the long-term vision was kind of the stuff that we could do immediately on, like, lowering the plant 10 degrees. I mean, we see plant temperatures jump 10 degrees in the back of the truck all the time. Just lower that. Yeah. Let's bring it down on jobs now. So yeah. Still not seeing any other questions. If there's, we'll give them a couple more minutes. Anything else for Richard? All right. Thank you again, Dr. Willis. Great presentation. Great seeing you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
And thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you.